This is the first webinar in our series of webinars that is hosted by the Maine Farmer Resource Network. The Maine Farmer Resource Network is a coalition of Maine agricultural agencies and organizations working together to connect aspiring and beginning farmers to resources for farm business success. So today we have a collaboration between the University of Maine Cooperative Extension, which is where I am. My name is Chris Howard, and I run the Maine New Farmer Project. And I can put some information about that in the chat. And I will introduce Nick Rowley, who's going to facilitate today's discussion.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Yep. So I'm Nick Rowley, work for University of Maine Cooperative Extension in Franklin County. And today our topic is going to be dealing with too much water on the farm. As in the summer of 2023, we all experienced, well, about a whole summer's worth of rain. And that brought this subject into the light for a lot of farmers. And so originally we planned to do this session at the Maine Agricultural Trade Show back in January 2024. And surprise, surprise, we had a serious weather event and it got canceled. So here we are doing the session now. And I'd like to introduce Candy Gilpatrick from the NRCS to go first and talk about dealing with too much water. And after that, we will hear from Ian Jerolmack from Stonecipher Farm. All right, Candy.
Great. Thank you, Nick. So as Nick said, I'm an engineer with NRCS here in Maine. I cover the southern part of the state. And I've gone from working here and dealing with droughts to dealing with too much water. So it's just, no one's ever happy, right? It's like the temperature of the building. Either it's too hot, too cold, too much water, not enough water. Okay, and now it's my turn to have technical difficulties to figure out how I advance my slides when I'm in screen share. Any suggestions? Hang on a second. Stop. Go ahead.
Are you able to click the little arrow buttons at the bottom? Oh, there you go.
I got to go. Thank you. So the first question is, where is your water coming from? Is it just that you have a lot of extra water because it's just what's falling right straight down from the sky? Are you having problems with the water that's running down slope? Is it a problem because of all the land that's draining across your farm fields that you're trying to operate? Is it bleeding out of the slopes? Do you have a situation where you may have a sandier soil laying over the top of a clay, heavier soil on a slope, and so it goes down into the sand and then bleeds out of the slopes where it hits that harder soil underneath? Or is it a situation where it rains, but it just doesn't drain away? It sits in the soil and your land is flat, your land is a tighter soil, and it just isn't being able to drain away. So before you can kind of figure out how to handle the soil, you've got to figure out, handle the water, excuse me, you need to figure out where that water is coming from. So Ian and I are going to talk about different ways to get rid of that water. One would be crop rotation, giving it a little bit of change of what you've got going on so you don't always have the same row set up. You get some different crops, things that are in there that may have a deeper rooting system to help break up the hard pan. We'll talk about that in a minute to get things changing that way. Go into no-till operations where you don't have as much compaction going on from the equipment going across the property. And then also do stuff to break up that hard pan, such as subsoilers, rippers, chisel plows, those types of things. So I did a little researching on this because, to be honest with you, I didn't really understand the difference between a ripper and a subsoiler. And they're very similar. It has to do more about the depth and the area that they're ripping through. So what I was able to find is that a ripper would be, it's the implement that breaks through that hard pan or the plow pan. So after a lot of conventional farming opportunities, if you were doing mowbar plowing, those types of things, you are constantly scraping down to that same level, and you'll actually make a hard pan as indicated in this picture by the black line. And that is now becoming a restrictive layer of everything for your root systems of your crops, to the water being able to drain away from your site. So if you go through the ripper or the subsoiler, you're going down into this area and you're breaking up that hard pan, thus allowing that water to continue down through the profile of the soils. Here are some of the differences that you're talking about. The ripper is ripping open the soil, where the tractor subsoiler is more of a breaking up the whole area and loosening it as opposed to just ripping one strip going down through. Here you can see the different working depths. The subsoiler is actually going down upwards of 24 inches, where the ripper is not quite as deep. The suitability for the subsoiler is when the soil is compact. The ripper is if you've got some rockier areas. So more ways to get rid of water is tiling or drainage. And I know a lot of folks like to, that's one of the first things they'll throw out. Can I put drainage pipe in through here? If you are a USDA participant, and I need to say this since I'm representing USDA here today. If you are a USDA participant, you need to go in through the Farm Service Agency and request a 1026 form determination, which is basically to go out and make sure that the soils you're on aren't a wetland or a farmed wetland, those types of things, because I'd hate to have you go out to do work in your fields and then lose your ability to receive USDA assistance. But if that determination is made that no, you just are dealing with some water, but it's not technically a wetland spot, then you can go in and do ditching and do perimeter ditchings. Maybe if you've got a real flat field, it's worth putting even a center ditch in, going back to the old days of bedding fields. The other option is subsurface drainage. The important thing to think about whether you do the subsurface drainage is the spacing of those lines. And out west, they're doing a lot of stuff where there's concerns of the nutrient loss and actually do water gates on their subsurface drains. Again, totally different type of seasonal high water table and soils out there. But they'll put water gates in on their drainage pipes so they don't drain all the time, so they're not losing those nutrients. So be aware of that if you're putting down your fertilizers or your manures on your fields, and then you have a rain event and high drainage going on, then you may lose those nutrients right off, which is not good for the waters and not good. You wasted time putting nutrients down. The slope really makes a big difference on some of these items as well, meaning that you need to get slope on the pipe, but if it's too much, you're going to get, or on the ditches, you're going to get a lot of rilling and washing that way. So I threw in this picture of just showing what the subsurface drains or tiles, as we've referred to them over the years past, would do for you. And you put those in and it's helping pull down that seasonal high water table, draining out through the pipes. NRCS recommends putting it in an aggregate type of material. So basically you trench it out, you put down a thin layer of sand, you put your pipe in, and then you surround it with a sandy gravel mix. And the reason you do that is it becomes a filter medium. So that means your soil particles won't be moving into your pipe. If you don't do that and your pipe's at a steep slope and you have soil that has pretty good movement of water, you're going to lose some of your soil particles. And so that's where you're going to have the soils moving, caving in, and then it'll actually develop small sinkholes in your fields. I'm sure folks can think of that with old fields that have been tiled over the years. The tiles may get plugged, blocked, the old pieces that have come apart in between each other, and you'll find sinkholes that have formed because of that. And that's just the soils moving out through these pipes as well. I do know there's folks in the area that do tile drainage that does not, that they're just doing it in with a ditcher or tile plow, as they refer to it. And that is definitely an option. We're actually looking at it as NRCS, as if that's something they do allow it out in the other parts of the country. And we're looking at trying to bring that in as a practice that we'll do. And one of the biggest reasons is because there's a limited supply of gravel. And are we being wasteful by putting gravel into these mediums? The one problem of those is that when you start doing your layouts, and that's what this is a photo of, is different types of layout configurations for your subsurface drains, you need to put your pipes closer together because you're just not getting the same drawdown if you're not pulling out such a large envelope. So if you go back to this picture, you can see you're really pulling that gravel's being able to pull it all the way almost from the surface all the way down through. You can drain out that whole area, where if you don't have that gravel, you're going to just be pulling from a smaller column of that water. And so you need your pipes a lot closer. They'll be putting them somewhere between 30 and 50 feet apart. So they put in a lot of pipe. They can put it in cheaper, but they're putting in a lot more. So are you gaining that much? yet to be determined based off of your soils. The configurations here are some different scenarios. The one that I have seen the most, that we use the most in Maine, is probably the herringbone. It may not be a perfect layout like that, but you'll have a main line going up through the center and then have spurs going off to the sides to help drain the different dips and valleys of your field. And then this is a generic chart, and that word I want to emphasize, generic, but it's giving you a feel of how close your pipelines would need to be based off of what type of soil you're dealing with. I'll give you a minute to kind of look at that based off of your soils. As you can see, obviously, a heavier soil, you're going to put your pipes a lot closer together. And the other part of this is maintenance. Make sure that you're not getting ruts. I've been out to a lot of orchards where you start getting ruts in between your rows of your trees, and then that's from your spraying. You had to get out there and not the perfect conditions. You did a little sinking in, but now all of a sudden that rut is working against you. So those are things to keep in your mind of what can I do as maintenance at the surface that helps the water infiltrate and or run off better. Making sure, I've seen a lot of times also with hay fields, you get down to the edge, you have a ditch on the edge, and you're getting down there doing your hay, you do a turn. And again, after years and years, you start building up a ridge on that edge from constant turning activity. And then all of a sudden your field can't drain because there's a berm between your edge of your field and that ditch. So those are things to think about. Maintaining mowing, you start getting a lot of vegetation that's died back and died down. You get those big tufts in there that are, again, blocking up your drainage ditch and making it not flow as efficiently. If it's an existing ditch, and commonly NRCS standpoint is that you're allowed to maintain that ditch to what it was originally built at. Again, sediment removal is another thing. You'll get sediment that are built up in the channels that's keeping it from being able to drain and flow like you intended. And then making sure that your outlets are staying open. A lot of times your vegetation, soil sloughs, all these different things may be blocking your tire lines, and now they can't work like you want. And so you've got the pipe all buried, but it's just not blowing out the ends as you had hoped it would hope it would work. So just keeping an eye on it, going out, is it free draining, just like a person would do around the footer drain of their house foundations. All those types of items, are factors that are going to help you maintain and continue to get that water to leave your site when you have wet conditions. And I believe, yes, that's what I have to share. Hopefully that gave you some highlights of what we are looking to, you're looking for answers on. And we lost Ian.
Well, thanks, Candy. Does anybody have any questions for Candy? Well, I know I have one, and
Okay.
So as far as like the drainage tile goes, it's like a plastic perforated pipe, right? It's like 6 inches, something in that diameter.
Yep,
And
it's commonly a 4-inch pipe with a slits in it, and then you can get it with or without the sock on it or a fabric sleeve over it. The sleeve, if you're bedding it with gravel, that's not necessarily to have the sleeve, but it's a good thing to have in your soils if you are going just a direct burial.
great. That next question was about the sock.
Okay, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
And then there's the other thing, like a lot of folks like to put in or talk about putting in the pipe that's got the has the holes in it. And if you put the hole type, like you put around a house foundation, you need to bed that in stone, which is probably not what you want to do in your farm fields. So you really want to use the pipe with the black, and the slits in it. And there's 2 different grades of that on from different companies. But there's one they call the heavy duty. The ADS carries a heavy duty. Solino just has one type of a pipe, but there's just different things to look at and what you're, you want the heavier duty pipe. You don't want one that's going to crush because it's got to live through frost activity, a lot of compaction on the surface, those types of things.
I have a couple questions too.
Sure.
I get a lot of questions about drainage in high tunnels, so water accumulating in the inter-row spaces between the planting rows and just kind of build up of water. Do you have suggestions for managing drainage inside high tunnels?
That's a very good question. The part that I've actually been involved in more is where it's coming in on the outside edges. And so I'm wondering if you're getting stuff inside because it's not getting it on the outside. And so where those, we often have gone in and helped folks by putting subsurface drain, because now you've taken all your rainwater that would have been covering that 30 by 72 or 30 by 100 high tunnel, and now you're dropping it on just on those sides and that little drip edge, and it runs back in. So the big thing is do subsurface drain as your perimeter, almost like a roof runoff drain to handle it on the outside edges. And that should be effective enough because usually your high tunnels are 30-ish feet wide, 30 to 40. That should be effective enough for that drawdown, because even in the tightest of soils that I just had on that chart, it was tighter spacing than that. So that should on the outside, and that way you can put it in without disrupting your high tunnel. The other thing would just be looking at taking your soil shape in your high tunnel and almost making a crown center, so that way it's encouraging those center parts to drain out to the sides. And Ian's back, and has much more experience on the high tunnel side of it, so he may be able to add on to that question or the answer for that question.
Great. And then I have one more question, which is, do you have a sense of the cost per acre for installing tile?
I can't tell you per acre because, again, that's going to vary based off what your soil types are and how many runs. But I will tell you that NRCS's, we figure it's somewhere between, depending on accessibility, et cetera, but we're usually figuring somewhere between $8 and $9 a linear foot to install it. And that's with the gravel bedding. If you're not going to do that and you're going to have them come in with a plow ditch, it's cheaper than that. But if you're doing it the current NRCS way, it's about $8 to $9 a linear foot.
Thank you.
I missed the first part of that question, but the second part of that question, I know Warren Hood does the mechanical ditching, that just setting a point in the ground and installing it without gravel. You know, it literally just drags a point through and installs the tile. And 5 years ago, he told me it was about $1 a foot, to give you a rough idea. Installed. It's probably higher than that now. And what was the first part of that question about high tunnels? I'm sorry that I missed it.
Oh, no, you're good. I get a lot of questions about how to manage water inside the tunnels, like just water pooling in the interrow spaces, or just like the soil really just holding on to a lot of water within those tunnels.
Yeah. Boy, I have a lot to say about that. Yeah.
Perfect.
I have a lot to say about that. It's probably the bulk of what I have to talk about. High tunnels, to me, are the most sensitive place for excess water, because I think we all agree they're probably the highest value to begin with. And so if the productivity is being diminished by issues of ponding or saturation, it's tragic. Especially because I consider it so fixable. A couple things. Is it my turn? Yeah.
Well, yeah. Before you start, I think I had one more question for Candy, because it sounds like you got a lot to say. So maybe we should save it for your turn. And before we move on, I was curious, Candy, if the NRCS had programs to help deal with too much water, not necessarily in the field, but say like around livestock facilities or wash pack sheds or things like that. And if you could just speak on that briefly.
Sure. So we have our part of it is not how do I say this? Our part is that we want to deal with a resource concern, and often our resource concerns, especially with livestock, is the manure and the transfer of nutrients. And if you have water running through your feedlot where your animals are, then yes, we're concerned because it's a conveyance for that nutrients. So yes, we have a lot of programs with heavy use areas, manure storages. We're doing more and more with roofing facilities, so you're not dealing with that moisture. So even though, because I call it homogenizing, when the animals are out in the manure on a concrete pad, it seems like it's a great time, but then when the animals start walking around and it's pouring rain, they're just mixing that water into it and it can't even get out. So now you got the sloppy manure. So if we can do stuff that's more roofed, that makes handling that a lot easier to do. So we have those types of programs. We'll also do things where we try to get water again kicked out around grass waterways, rock-lined waterways. We're doing a lot with slope stability type projects where a lot of these fields are starting to have head cuts that are forming, and what can we do to help stabilize those situations as well. So there's a lot of different things that we're involved in. It's not just the subsurface side of the drainage. We can do a lot of different things with the nutrient side of it and field head cuts. And then we're also, for those that don't think they have enough water, we're also involved with helping to get water for irrigation reasons. So if there's no more questions, I'm all set, and I'll let Ian jump in on this on the on his stuff. Like I said, I figured he'd have a lot to say on the high tunnels and on the drainage. I had a meeting the other day with Jared Hood that you spoke of, Warren and Jared, and I'm trying to remember, and I think he said it was $1.15 foot is what he's doing right now. So it's not much more. Maybe it's $1.25. So it's not that much higher.
And right before you start, Ian, I just want to do a quick poll. We are putting this webinar on with grant money from the USDA NIFA, and I just need a little bit of demographic information. So if you wouldn't mind filling out this poll real quick, and then the floor will be Ian's.
My
Okay,
poor little county. My poor little county didn't make it on your survey.
Uh-oh.
Do I have to mark other? Or maybe I do not live in Maine. I have to choose that one.
I guess you can. I thought I got them all. Sorry about that.
We can
I'll choose Androscoggin. I'll team up with Androscoggin on this one.
Sorry, Ian. Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Go ahead. So Nick has some photos I sent him, and we're just gonna wing this. I don't have any power to present my own photos because that's not a strength of mine. I'm a farmer. That's why I've been asked to speak. I don't do PowerPoints. I don't have snazzy presentations. That's especially why I wanted Candy to go first. She sent me that, so I got to review that ahead of time. That was an awesome presentation with really great material that is probably mostly what people want to hear about. I'm here with, anecdotal tidbits about how we've solved things on this farm. Nick, how do you want to present my images? Uh-oh, I can't hear anything. Oh, why can't I hear anything? I can't hear anything. There.
It's not you, Ian. We can't hear him either.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah, Ian is ready for the presentation.
Okay. This is plagued by technical difficulties. We just lost power here, so I'm on my hotspot. So Chris,
Okay.
I sent you Ian's presentation, and if
You got it.
I get knocked off, you have to pull it up, okay?
Okay.
Sorry about that.
And I'll say I don't really require it. I'm scanning this top bar, and I don't see too many farmers, and so I want to do whatever people want. Oh, look at that! There we go. What? Well, good. And we can just go to some aerial photo of my farm, I suppose, if you don't mind. One of those, like maybe image number 3. I can't control it, I don't think. Yeah, my name's Ian Jerolmack. I own and run Stonecipher Farm in Bowdenham. I've been here 16 years. When I bought it, this was an empty field, so every bit of infrastructure and gravel and everything has been my own design and my own construction. So there's been a lot of learning curves, and I think we've overcome most of them. At year 16, I'm feeling pretty good about where we're at. I can't say that that was always the case. I've learned a lot of hard lessons, especially about water. You can see that I have quite a lot of high tunnels, even in the upper right corner there. There's 2 more. Those are also mine. That's all my property. Why would I put those over there in the trees? I was really sick of sunshine that year. The NRCS gave me some more tunnels, and I said, I want them not in the direct sunshine. 2023 is pretty scarring, but if you guys recall, the previous 3 years were very extreme drought, high temperatures, extreme drought, a lot of wind, dust, all of that. Now we go through I believe what we decided was the wettest year in Maine's history. I think that's what I recently read. And buddy, move over. That might happen again, by the way. I might have to pick this thing up and move to a different room. But most of my farm, if you want to go to the next image that's overhead, I think it's the opposite angle of my farm. Most of my farm is on that ridge that you see going from the bottom right to the top left. Topographically, that's the highest, that's the ridge on my farm. The road sort of represents the highest point. And also, as the glaciers would have it, that's where I have a bunch of sand sitting on top of, deposited on top of ledge. And so I'm not going to talk a lot about that. That has good drainage mostly. I will say one thing, that because it's sitting on ledge, there is really bizarre ponding that happens sometimes. Even though it's sandy soil that drains well, you can imagine underneath the ledge might do this, even though the earth does this. And, you know, that is, you can't fix that. Not fixable. There's no drain tile that can be installed down into that without blasting. Believe me, there were times where I thought about blasting, like, whoa, what would that cost? But one should probably sooner buy another farm at that point. But I do have what Candy mentioned, where this is sand, and then coming down from there, we go into very hydric, I think we call it, soils. I have Buxton, but I have the really poor end of Buxton, and then I've got Scantic, Lemoyne, the worst one, the heaviest, meanest clay in Maine. And what that means is as the water goes down into my ridge and hits the ledge, it sheets down the ledge and then it pops out. So we've got springs on all sides of that. Again, in hindsight, should I bought this farm? Absolutely not. But here I am, and we found a lot of solutions. So assuming we're talking to farms that want to find solutions and don't want to move, that's hopefully what I can help with here today. So my first solution was to turn no-till for all problems. And I could, and maybe will accidentally talk way too much about that, but I can't say enough about converting to no-till. But specifically regarding soils and drainage, the ridge, no-till helps only in saving water and not letting it all drain away, having more organic matter and having mulches covering the soil. The soil is never exposed. No soil on my farm now is ever exposed to the light of day. I'll say that again. No soil on my farm is exposed to the light of day anymore. It's either sod, mulch, or gravel. And mulch is either compost, wood chips, straw, something. But that's been an enormous boon to our farm in many, many, many ways. But you can imagine when there's a 4-inch rain event or something, there's a lot of absorption that happens before pooling or percolation or anything. Regarding the clay soils, I was inspired by a farmer named Richard Perkins. He's an Englishman that lives in Sweden. He's not hard to find. He's in love with himself, so he has quite a lot of material you can go find online. He's written about 8 books, and he has a YouTube channel and whatever. But when I was considering no-till, he's in Sweden, and what's cool about watching his videos is it looks like here. It's spruce trees, and poplar trees, and swampy-looking pastures, and his entire market garden blue clay. And basically, as he espouses, his whole garden is essentially kind of floating on top of that. Where's my camera? You know, maybe his plants are sitting this high up above on compost, wood chips, various other added mulches and organic matters. Now, I know that may not sound like a very feasible solution, but there's a lot of other reasons to go no-till. But I will just say that the way we prepared the clay soils is also segueing into the tunnels. My tunnels are on clay. Obviously raised beds, regardless of whether you're interested or not in no-till. It's why beds are raised typically, is for drainage, so that extreme rain events, the water has somewhere to drop to. You can drop the water table by at least the height of the bed. So the heavier the soils, typically the higher you raise your bed. There's many ways to raise a bed. I'm not going to get into equipment today. You can find that information. I used to own a lot of equipment, and I used my clay. I had very high raised beds, and it worked usually for a lot of reasons. There was other reasons that I moved away from that. But if you look at the carrots in this, the carrots come down, start in the bottom left corner and go towards the center of the screen. That whole field is on clay. And our approach there is very similar to the approach in the greenhouse, which was I made raised beds mechanically first with a tractor. I rototilled, I did the whole thing. I used discs and threw it up as high as I could, and then tilled and kind of made a boxy high bed as best as I could. And then we laid slab wood in the pathways and filled the pathways up to the level of the top of the bed with slab wood. Now, this sounds crazy, and this maybe is, I don't know how this sounds to people. To me, it was a cheap carbon source. It's a sponge. It's something to raise people's foot traffic up out of the muck. It's a way to cover the soil for weeds and for evaporation. Again, it's cheap. It's usually free. Slab wood is the offcut from sawmills. My local sawyer sells me a pulp truck full for $500. That's just the delivery charge. The material doesn't cost anything. You can probably find it cheaper than that. Point is I filled those pathways up with slab wood and then topped it with wood chips so you're not walking on slab wood, and then did my compost on top of the beds. And then if we go to, I can't see my other slides, but let's find another slide where maybe you can sort of see what my beds look like. You can keep going. Well, there you go. So go back one. Thank you. These are some beds in I think late fall. We have a cover crop on the right and a straw mulch on the left. Again, having nothing to do with water and hydrology, we just never want to leave the bed surface empty, even in the winter. So if we can't get a cover crop on, we mulch. I will say, having to do with rain, and this is a digression, but if you picture a heavy rain event going straight down onto your bare beds that you just picked carrots out of, that's probably the worst approach to soil management you can do. But we excuse it by saying it's November and I can't. That's really rude. That's really rude. You say I can't do what can I do? I can't plant a cover crop. And I would say you can do that. Our farm makes that pay, and that's a digression that I won't get into, but we literally spread straw on top of all of our empty beds. On the right is rye. However, the point is to look at this bed surface. So that's what we have when we're done. As you see, there's wood chips in the pathway and there's compost on the bed, and the compost is both the mulch and a soil. And I'll invite questions about this. I won't go on too much about it, but that is what it will look like on top of clay afterwards. However, the bed top at that point is more than a foot above the bottom of the clay pathway. And so when I'm explaining this, I'm attempting to explain this in an elementary manner. I kind of say, if you can imagine that clay being rubber, and my bed is up above that on the bed top, and then it falls off to the bottom of the pathway, that is your surface that water doesn't infiltrate well, right? Especially when it's raining 4 inches. So I have a pathway that functions as a well and is full of wood, and it absorbs water, and it also lets it back out, and it acts like a flywheel. And I think that's fundamental to organic matter in soil on farms, period. We understand organic matter is a flywheel for water and nutrients. So the more organic matter you have, pretty much, I think, always the better. So to get into high tunnels, and I don't know if we have any pictures of my high tunnels. Forgive me, everyone. I sent this to Nick back when we were supposed to do this, and I didn't review this yesterday. I also want to be guided by questions. I don't want to talk too much about anything that no one wants to hear about. But if there's any slides that are of my tunnels inside my, yeah, there you go. That's a good one. So my tunnels are all flat. I think that should be a goal of anyone putting up a high tunnel, is that the earth should be flat to make your life better and to make the usability of the tunnel better. When I see tunnels on a hill, I kind of cringe. There's ways to remedy it that I would argue are cheaper than dealing with a high tunnel's lifespan of problems. In other words, you put a high tunnel up on a 5-degree grade and it lasts 30 years. That's 30 years of struggle versus building a terrace or orienting it differently. I'll say just quickly about orientation. In the Northeast, we tend to obsess over an east-west orientation. I don't agree with that as a pretense for good growing. I think we tell ourselves because we're in the north and we're cold, we need really good light exposure in the winter. However, no one makes their money in the winter. Everyone makes their money in the summer. And the east-west orientation is worse in the summer for summer crops. And so again, I'll drop that there. And if anyone wants to ask me more about that, all of my tunnels are oriented north-south. And so that's only to say that people putting up a new high tunnel should really open up their minds to what is absolutely best for the lifespan of the people working in there and for the lifespan of all products that will ever be grown in there. And then say, maybe I don't want to put it here. We have very adverse topography and soil. And so I would say if we can do it, absolutely anyone can do it. You can put your tunnel where it's near to your water, near to electricity, near to base of operations, near to one another. And you can do site work to set yourself up for success. Let's go and assume that people didn't do that and they have a very wet tunnel now. So my tunnels, I built terraces with a bulldozer for my tunnels and they went up level and they look great. However, that doesn't change that I used very hydric soils. That's a great photo. So look at that height difference between those two tunnels and you'll get an idea for the adversity of the topography I was working with. But if you came here to my farm today and walked past them, you may not even notice. They're so usable. They're so user-friendly. They're so crop-friendly. But I managed to keep them right up against our base of operations where it's easy to get power, manage water, all those things. The further a tunnel is from base of operations, the less care it'll get, period. But to speak of hydrology, you can see there's water in that ditch. There's always water in that ditch. It's pretty much year-round. But that ditch is squarely 2 feet below the surface of that downhill greenhouse. So if you're inside that downhill greenhouse, the top of the soil is 2 feet above that water table. So I did that ahead of time, but you can do that after the fact. There's all kinds of trenching or drainage tile that can be done after the fact. And I really want to push farmers to do that work and spend that money. Whether it's digging out and doing a proper tile like Sandy's diagram or doing it yourself and backfilling it with whatever you've got. I've also do backfill with wood chips instead of gravel. And I can talk more about that. But I will say that even though my tunnels were flat and I achieved a workable surface, we still ran into issues with crops because of the poor percolation of water. And so I built my lovely beds that I'm describing in there that were somewhat higher than the pathways, but it was undercover and I didn't take it very seriously at first. And then we had, it was beautiful in there. We could grow beautiful lettuce and we could grow beautiful this and that. But what we were experiencing after a while was, and this is the point, is that a 100-foot row of tomatoes might be gorgeous for the first 10 feet. I'm done. It might be gorgeous for the first 10 feet, and then we would see a decline in health for 15 feet, and then maybe go back up again. And that was a mystery to me for a while. So fast forward after a couple of years of misery, what I realized is underground, I had created, a flat clay swamp, and there was anaerobic soil conditions down there. I mean, the smell was horrendous, that by itself. If you're wondering if that's what you're dealing with, just dig down. The smell will tell you. And anaerobic conditions, are toxic for most crops. And so I thought, what am I going to do? I thought I've done everything right. There's no-till thing and the compost on the top and everything. And I'll tell you what we did. That's the point of this. This is my favorite solution to every water problem of any that I've ever heard, is what we did. I recognized the value of the tunnel. I recognized the potential for crops in there. And I took the expensive solution. And when we took in 2021, when we took our summer crop out, we hand dug out the pathways 16 inches down, threw all that dirt on top of the beds. We buried slab wood and dead trees in the pathways. And if you want to know more, I'll tell you more, but that's what we did. Put the wood chips on top, level out all that crazy mixture of compost and soil and wood chips that we'd thrown on the beds, and put new compost on top. And afterwards, it looked exactly the same as when we started, but the entire thing was a foot higher. And all that we brought in was wood. And so we were able to utilize the soil within the greenhouse to raise the entire greenhouse by replacing the soil with slab wood, which also lowered our water table to the bottom of that pathway. Put a huge sponge in there and raise the improved growing depth of the bed that was left over. I want to ask everybody if you have questions now. I feel like I've been talking for a really long time and gone on a few different tangents. What are you guys thinking about?
The first thing that comes to mind with what you just described for raising the bed.
If anybody's talking, I can't hear you.
Oh.
I could hear you, Matt.
Oh, okay.
Me?
Can you hear me, Ian? Yeah. The first thing that came to mind with what you just described is, how often do you have to kind of go in and add more slab wood and kind of replace those intercrop row spaces in the tunnels? Like, what is the maintenance like for that over time?
I first off can't answer that because it's only been 3 years. The second thing I'll tell you is that typically wood that is buried in the ground doesn't rot. I don't know if you guys have noticed this in any of your life experiences, but typically if wood is down out of air, it doesn't rot. I don't know if it's going to rot or not. However, I will say that it is typical maintenance of all beds on the farm to add wood chips when the pathway has sunken to below the surface of the bed. I want them to basically be the same. And we do that for weed control anyway. And so if you refresh the top with wood chips, I don't think we will ever dig it out again, because as the wood, if and when the wood rots or collapses, it's now humus. It's not clay. It's still acting in the same capacity, I believe. And our adding fresh wood chips on the top, it's my belief that we'll just be perpetuating the same thing. I'll say that I have particularly bad soils, but I see these same water issues at farms that have amazing soils. I'll say like Six River Farm down the road, they arguably have the best soil of any farmer in Maine. Maybe top 1% of all soils in Maine are down there on Browns Point. But if it rains a lot and there's water pouring off a roof of a greenhouse and the water table raises to the surface outdoors, you're in the same boat, especially in the off season. In other words, in winter, fall, winter, spring, when there's not much evaporation, water's not really moving. It's maybe even frozen outside, so it can't move. I know that they took a mini excavator inside of one of their tunnels and after the fact dug in a proper drainage tile on the inside. I've never asked them why they did it on the inside and not the outside, But I'll say that my point being, they chose to solve the problem. They didn't just live with it. And I know that worked for them. I believe the exact same thing could be achieved by putting it on the outside, but I may be wrong. The outside, that may sort of inundate the tile, overwhelm the tile with the amount of water coming off the roof, and maybe inside would allow the tile to work in a slower way, more of a percolation way. If you go back a slide, one slide, we had 2 tunnels that had less topography. And in other words, the native topography of those 4 is pretty steep, and we have 2 where it's less steep. And what that ended up meaning was that the water in the hollows between the tunnels could raise higher and leave slower. And it was the water table inside of the tunnels was alarmingly high, even though we had done this entire dig out wood in the paths. What I was seeing was a lot of winter kill, and that's a very serious issue when it comes to too much water in the winter. Plants need it dry on the surface, and they need the air as dry as possible. And we were getting so much, lateral sort of sheeting of water into the tunnel that the surface was visibly wet all winter. The surface of the beds was visibly wet the entire winter, strictly from water coming from the outside. And so what our solution there was to that pathway that the camera is looking down, that represents the left-hand side of our tunnel. We dug that out by hand. Again, getting an excavator in there can feel overwhelming, or you ask yourself, how am I going to drive in? Which part of my season am I going to sacrifice to drive an excavator into my tunnel? Or how much does that cost to rent? Or what if I mangle my greenhouse? We did it by hand. 2 people, it took them a day. I mean, that's a lot of work, but it's not insurmountable. And we dug that 2 feet deep, threw all that soil into the greenhouse, and put the tile down there, wrapped it up with old remay, and then backfilled it with wood chips, not gravel, because I'm a cheapskate. But I also felt like wood chips are doing more jobs. That's my belief. I can't stand by that because, again, it's not old enough. But I will say that we immediately dropped the water table by about a foot and solved every issue in those 2 tunnels simply by adding an uphill side, single tile, the length of the greenhouse, and I put it level. That's another thing I want to mention. We get pretty obsessed with like plumbing code and best practices or whatever. Certainly, if you're tiling an entire field, you need to know that it's really working and leaving, because it's a ton of money. But if a 4-inch tile is, has this much water in it, if it's dead level, that water will leave. You don't need pitch for that water to leave. That water will leave. That's kind of I don't know. I think it's a novel idea, because sometimes it's the pitch that can be the limiting factor. In other words, if you can't run that tile far enough away from your tunnel to have it leave somewhere, you might look around and say, well, there's nowhere for it to leave. If I dig a 2-foot deep trench and it has to pitch 1 inch every 12 feet or 1 inch every whatever, that's going to be 300 feet from my greenhouse. I can't do it. I just want people to know that we have them leaving level and it works. Any other questions or any other slides we should look at here?
Yeah, Ian, I have a question going back to this slide. And I think you mentioned that, can you see my pointer here? That there's water in between these tunnels all year round. Do you have issues with snow shedding from either one of these tunnels and being able to clear the snow from this path in the winter?
I didn't hear your question. I heard you say there's always water down there.
I'm sorry, Ian. So I get back to my question is, do you have issues with snow shedding off of these tunnels in the winter and access to clear the snow out if there's always perpetual water here?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll say that again, they're north-south oriented. And in my experience with prevailing winds, I do not need to clear snow, which is a pretty awesome. So I'm always prepared to do it. And yes, if that water's not frozen, yeah, that's a bear. I can drive on that slope. It is not undrivable to drive uphill of that ditch. And so what I normally do in the winter, if we have a big snow and the snow all falls down, is I just run through. I don't plow. I just track it so that if it snows again, I have somewhere to drive. And I would recommend that to everyone to do with their tunnels all the time is if there's a big snow, just drive your tractor in a figure 8 between your tunnels so that if it snows again, you have a place to drive. Because if the snow gets 18, 24, 30 inches deep, your tractor, you no longer get traction. It lifts your tractor off the ground and you can't go. And then you're stuck like actually picking it up and backing out. I've never had to do anything like that. I've never even plowed between these tunnels, I'll say.
Great. Thank you. And I think we have about 5 minutes left. Does anybody else have questions for Ian?
Nick, I'd also like to launch one more poll.
Yeah, let's do that.
I think. Oh. Okay, here we go. That's a quick one.
Ian, while folks are filling out the poll, where do you source your like straw and mulching material from? Is it on farm or off farm? And did you struggle with that last year with like the hay and straw shortages that we saw?
Yeah, that's a good question. The straw I buy from Roy Burpee in New Brunswick, Canada, and they did not have too much rain last year, or not like we did. That's far enough away. The prices didn't change. The availability didn't change. And that's where everybody in my neighborhood has been getting straw for as long as I've been here. It's not organic, but he signs the affidavit or whatever, and Mofka is happy with that. So that's where I get my straw. My wood chips I buy from Country Fair. They grind up people's stumps and everything. They always have a mountain of it. I pay for that. I pay for it. We use so much of it that I need it always here. Compost, I use Campbell and Sons in Litchfield. Again, he's not organic, but he it's acceptable, my Mofka certification. Or like any organic matter doesn't have a temperature record, you can use a wait period. In other words, you can apply any compost that's unfinished or otherwise, as long as you adhere with the wait period. But anyway, I use Campbell and Sons. I sometimes use Casella's, but I don't really like theirs. I used to use MB Bark. I don't really know. They're cheap. And so is Casella's compared to some of the smaller outfits, but the quality varies a lot. It's really hard to recommend them.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much for your insight and perspective, Ian. I think you're almost taking like a Google culture approach and expanding it out to a farm scale, which I think is very interesting. If there's no more questions, I think we can call it a wrap. I just want to thank you, everybody, for attending, and thank you to our speakers, Ian and Candy.
Thanks for having me.
Great. Take care.
Thanks so much for your time, Ian. I really appreciate this. The number of questions I get about managing water in high tunnels is like probably number 1 or 2 on my list of things people come and ask me about.
Well, yeah, good. I likewise, people come to me for this, and I'm no-till, and so some of this sounds kind of woo-woo to people, I think, because it's already no-till is that, and so, but I really feel like even if the solution is just buying loam and dumping it inside of your tunnel, solve the problem is what I'm always espousing. Just solve the problem. Don't live with it. Anyone can buy 50-50, like so many outfits sell it, which is compost and loam mixed, and just buy 8 loads of that and pay a bulldozer to drive it right in. And then, but yeah, I'm happy to be in touch to, about any future questions like that, or to do a workshop here or whatever.
100%. I'll reach out at some point. I want to come visit the farm as it is. So
yeah, I would like that too.
So we do have a farm
Cool.
visit set up at Ian's farm.
All right.
I will send you that information.
Great.
all right, I have to sneak away to another.
Send me
meeting,
that
I think,
information so I can remember. Take
Oh,
care.
Ian, you are on.
Bye,
you're
everybody.
on my calendar.